Welcome to the Walled Garden Podcast. Here we nourish the gardens of our minds, one meaningful conversation at a time. If you'd like to find out more, go to thewalledgarden.com. Thanks for joining us. Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of the Walled Garden Podcast. In order to set up this conversation that I've got for you today, I would like to start by reading a poem or a piece of writing that I found within my own storehouse that I wrote a few months ago, and I think it perfectly sets up this conversation. It's called Our Treasure, and it goes like this. He whom the popular voice approves holds the key of the people's treasure. So says the wise poet and slave, Publius Sirus of Rome. Let us then ask, what is it that we admire? What do we hold to be of great value? Toward which aims does our desire draw us ever nearer? Where do we seek enlightenment? With whom do we wish to associate? Which characters find prominence on the stage of our society? There, and only there, will we come face to face with the sum of our collective character, our collective desires, and the gods we now worship. There is found the truth of the age. There will be found the contents of our collective unconscious. There will be known the false idols of our worship. There is the treasure we seek and the fate we summon. So when I came across this poem or piece of writing, whatever you call it today, I thought that it perfectly sets up our hearts, our minds, to listen to this wonderful guest who I've had on the show many times, Professor Joseph Siracusa. Because I start out this piece of writing by quoting Publius Sirus, the slave of Rome, who has a wonderful collection of sayings that you can purchase. But the quote from him is, "He whom the popular voice approves holds the key of the people's treasure." And what you get a sense of in Publius's writings is that he's taking such a broad view of society. He's standing back, he's watching the people, he's watching what's going on in society from afar. And from that vision, from that understanding, he is gaining a knowledge of what the people treasure, what they are moving towards, and perhaps the direction that they are going, as we've all seen in our own culture, you might say the global culture, if there is such a thing. We've seen over the past few years that we're not moving in a great direction. Now, I don't want to be too cynical because there are many ways that we are moving in an excellent direction. There are many things that we're doing right. That's certainly the case. But in these times of great intensity, where we see so many trials and tribulations and wars, and in my own hometown here in the Sunshine Coast and the greater southeast Queensland area, we've seen horrifying floods, and you can start to step back and say, okay, well, what's going on? Some of these things we can attribute just to the powers of nature. Other things we take responsibility for within each and every one of ourselves, right? We say, what am I doing to contribute to these perhaps more human horrors? But nonetheless, the reason why I thought that this would set up our conversation with Joseph Siracusa today is because I consider Joseph Siracusa as somebody who takes that broad view. He's somebody who steps back and watches what humans are like, and he delivers that information. He tells you what humans are like. And when you know what humans are like, then you have a much better foundation upon which you can judge perhaps where we are going. And I tell you, in times like these, you want a person like Joseph Siracusa on your side who's going to tell you what humans are like and perhaps where we're going. And there's a few things that I want to say before we dive into this conversation. Firstly, this is actually a live conversation between me and Joe. I was recently in Melbourne, as many of you will know, doing my interview for my U.S. visa, green card. And so I said to Joe, listen, I have to come and meet you, and I have to get a cigar with you, you know. And so we did that, and it was such a pleasure, such an honor to meet this great man. And he is truly a great man and a great soul. And so it was just an honor to watch him as he went into the cigar store and, you know, open up the door, you know, we're gonna get a cigar. And so we bought a cigar and we smoked that together. That was my first time doing that. You know, when in Rome, when you're with Professor Joseph Siracusa, you have to smoke a cigar. That's what you have to do. And then he took me to this mall, you might say, this open area where we could sit down and have an interview, have a conversation. And so we sat down for about 2.5 hours and talked through many things about, you know, history, diplomacy, where the world's heading at the moment. It's funny, you know, we recorded this before the Ukrainian crisis really started to heat up, before the invasion, which means that I'm basically going to let you be the judge of how on point Joseph was in his analysis of what was coming. I'll let you judge how relevant this information is, but a lot of it wasn't about the Ukraine crisis. We talked very broadly, which I really appreciated. And I guess the final thing that I do want to mention, and this might be for some of you the point where you jump off. I really hope not, but what ended up happening was I had my phone filming us and capturing audio. And then I had my Zoom audio device and 2 microphones, and we each had a microphone and we were recording ourselves. So I thought, great, fine, okay. And as I've prepared this episode today, it occurred to me that the Zoom audio device actually cut out after 15 minutes of this conversation, which is very sad, but nonetheless, I'm going to let the message speak for itself, and this is going to be a tough listen for some of you because you're going to get all of the background noise of that open air seating area within this mall. And what I hope is that you'll be able to see past that and listen closely, listen attentively over the next couple of hours or 2.5 hours. And to put aside the fact that there's all that background noise, but to listen closely to Joseph's voice as he drops this wisdom on us. So as I said, some of you may not be able to handle that. That's fine. Okay, stop listening if you want. But for those of you who really want to listen to the value that Professor Siracusa is giving us here, I had to release this episode. You know, regardless of how the quality of the audio has come out, the message is so important, and we have to listen to people like Joseph Siracusa. So that's my little pre-warning for you guys. It might be a bit of a slug listening through this, but if you're listening for the message over the quality of the audio, man, you guys are going to get some incredible lessons out of this conversation. So once again, you know, to Professor Siracusa, I say thank you so much for taking the time with me while I was down there. It was an absolute honor to meet this great man, and I really hope that you guys get as much as I did out of this conversation. So here we go. I think that's all recording pretty well there. Look, the only thing that I want to start with, Joe, is anybody who is listening, I have to say, this is an absolute dream of mine to, you know, for those who are just listening, you know, we've just met for the first time in person. You've shown me how to have a cigar, which is one of the coolest experiences ever, because, you know, I know that that's one of your favorite pastimes. And it's just a pleasure to sit down with you.
And a cigar is just what Freud said it is. It's just a cigar. It's very pleasant. You know, it feeds the brain, and it makes you very calm. John Kennedy smoked immensely, along with Mark Twain and other heroes. And and they became very expensive when government started to tax them and enjoy the taxes. But I'll tell you what, after why after a successful military raid or a Super Bowl or whatever it is, people bring out the cigars because they want to remember it. And a cigar helps you remember things. I think they're very...
So it's almost like a ritual.
It's a ritual, but I think it soothes the brain. Now, other drugs soothe the brain, but I've never done drugs. Drugs, to me, when I was a student at the University of Denver in the 60s, I met really brilliant people who started doing marijuana, and they became very stupid people in a year. When people say to me, drugs, marijuana screws up your brain. Oh yeah, I've seen it. But today we have legalized marijuana in about 40 of the American states. People try and make money on it. But look, we're digressing a little bit, and it's a pleasure to meet you. One day someone calls you up and says, "I want you to connect the dots in history," and you actually. Even though I've now written 55 books and been lecturing for 48 years, when someone asks you to do something, whether it's to give a scholarly paper in Europe or a broadcast on radio or television, you have to rethink the subject a little bit. And it always becomes fresh again, because you come to it with a new mandate, a new request. How does history work? And of course, even though I'm not a public intellectual, as I win all these awards for reading, I like to point out to people that no matter what people think about the internet, and it speeds things up, nothing has changed human nature in 3,000 years. We're the same people. We're the same people. We demonstrate power, we use power to change things, and nothing changes about greed or ambition. And if you read Socrates or Aeschylus or anybody, or even Julius Caesar, they're talking about the same things we did, and they're all about surviving and increasing their ability to influence things. And the other thing about this is, there's a wonderful series by Paul Cooper called The Fall of Civilizations, which I recommend to everybody. And it's about 12 hour-and-a-half YouTube things. They were on TV once, I guess. And they talk about the fall of the Aztecs and the Incas and the Icelandic empires and the Mali Empire and all the rest of it. And I watched a two-part series on the fall of Rome, that is, the fall of Byzantium, the second one. And that day when the Turkish armies invaded Istanbul, or Constantinople, there were people who woke up in the morning as part of the nobles. By 6 o'clock in the evening, they were slaves on their way to Morocco. And this reminds you how, if you think about antiquity and history, things can change very quickly.
The highest can become
the lowest. These people became slaves by the end of the day. And, when people get these DNA tests and they find out they got all kinds of DNA in their blood, well, you shouldn't be surprised. History had a way of doing that kind of thing. And so, my advantage when I talk about the Ukraine crisis or the Iranians, or America as an empire, a fading empire, or whatever it is that I'm able to draw the long historical bow. I've seen this before. Somebody said to me the other day, the Americans are announcing that the Russians are going to create a pretext, a false flag, to start a war in Ukraine, to renew the war. And I said, look, my entire generation got suckered in by the phony Gulf of Tonkin resolution about an attack on the Maddox and the Turner Joy that never took place. There were torpedo boats, but there were no torpedoes. And later generations got suckered into the war on terror through the weapons of mass destruction, which never existed. I said governments lie. Now, they lie for noble reasons. They think it's about time to get in. Same the way FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, wanted America desperately to enter the First World War and lied about everything to get them into the war. Yeah. And so, when you realize this, there's nothing unique about what's going on. And there's a pathology to what's going on. and there's a history to what's going on. And, you know, the saddest thing in my lifetime is that in the world, or in North America, only 5% of students study history anymore. It's their major.
Yeah.
And so you ask yourself, why is it that history collapsed? And we find out, and that's because a lot of political scientists claim to be historians as well as international relations experts. Now, the greatest political scientists I know don't know anything about history. They're faking it. I mean, they're just faking it. I'm talking about John Mersheimer. I'm talking about Bob Jarvis, the late Bob Jarvis. These guys they're just making it up as they go along. They would take my history books or Arnold Toynbee or somebody, and then they would extrapolate it for their theories. And it doesn't work that way. So we were supplanted by political scientists who dared to do something that historians and classicists don't do. Predict. They got on all these shows and they started making predictions. And they all missed the end of the Cold War. They all missed the collapse of the Shah. They all missed the rise of China. They all missed the North Korean bomb. They don't have a very good record, but they keep coming back at it. Now, historians are better than they are, but they just don't have the moxie to put themselves out there as predictors of the future. We're too smart for that.
Well, let me ask you something.
Sure.
Because the other day I was doing an interview on a podcast, and the wonderful lady who was interviewing me, she made a comment about what she kind of saw me doing, because I'm very interested in music and poetry and philosophy, theology, you know, a bit of history here and there, politics, and she said it's almost like a Renaissance way of thinking, the Renaissance man. And I always think of now, I wouldn't claim that about myself because I have a long way to go, but I always think of that quote from Heraclitus. He said something like, you know, these people who have specialized intelligence, they mistake that for wisdom, right? Because they're hyper-focused in one direction, but it seems like you're also of that kind of mind where we need to take a very broad look at the entire situation in order to have any idea of what might be coming in the future. And you also talk about this very wide bow, you say, and I think that's certainly something we tend today to have when you say this very narrow focus on this time and this place without digging our roots back in as far as we can to get that long-term view of things.
Yeah, I'm going to just put it a slightly different way.
Yeah, sure.
Which I'm sure you'll understand.
Yeah.
When I try to analyze something, whether it's in books or articles or media, I'm particularly concerned in not the actual crisis itself, but how we got to that. Most people don't know how we got to that. For example, people argue that Putin's on the warpath for all kinds of reasons. He wants to restore the Soviet Empire and Russian history. That's baloney. It's the nuclear balance of power. The Ukraine border is 449 kilometers to Moscow. The short-range nuclear missile there can take out the command and control center while he's asleep. And there are a lot of people in America who want to do that. They want to take him out. And so America goes around the world democratizing countries the same way Caesar's people went out to capture territory. It's nothing's changed. You know, we're going to democratize these great areas. And so I think that Putin has a lot of legitimacy here. And instead of thinking about Putin in terms of every nation has the right to sovereignty and make its own decision, I think if you look at it like the Cuban Missile Crisis, John Kennedy threatened to turn the world into ash unless the Soviets got those damn missiles out of Cuba. And the quid pro quo was America agreed not to invade Cuba. The deal was done. The crisis was averted. It's considered the great moment of the Cold War. And this is what Putin's thinking of. He's thinking about the grand bargain. And he can't get America to talk about a grand bargain because the younger people who work for Biden don't know what he's talking about. And Biden doesn't have the power to do these things himself. He could. But he's surrounded by people who are putting human rights in front of nuclear security. Now, I believe in human rights, but not at the expense of nuclear security. You know, right now, Americans, where half the world was jumping up and down about human rights in China, and I'm not going to go to the Olympics. Well, there was President Putin standing next to President Xi, cutting the next deal while we're at home doing nothing. And we're talking about the Uyghurs, about how they might make Nikes or something like that. And just a couple months ago, President Biden turned his back, and NATO turned his back on 10, 20 million Afghan women and girls who've now been sent back to the 7th century with Sharia law. I mean, what are these crocodile tears about people you can't help when people you could have helped? So, this, it's not just a double standard, it's a stupidity that informs the double standard. And and when people say, Putin wants to return the Soviet thing, no, he doesn't want to do that. He just wants to know that he can survive in the morning. And the nuclear balance of power is the most important thing in the world today for us to think about. No, very few people think about it, because it is the thing that can do us all in. Global climate will kill us slowly, but nuclear weapons will kill us quickly. And 20, 30, 40 of them brings in the nuclear winter that Carl Sagan so elegantly wrote about in the 1980s, and then that's the end of the game. Anyway, I'd like to point out that even with your enemies, there might be some legitimacy, though you don't have to concede. No one has a right to kill 50,000 people, but we don't have a right to allow him to kill 50,000 people. If Joe Biden can pick up the phone and say, "Hey, look, there'll be no NATO in Ukraine on my watch," and number two, there'll be no advanced first-strike weapons deployed in Ukraine on my watch. End of story. Let's go back to whatever we're going to do. And Biden can't get that out of his throat. So we have this lack of imagination. In this famous report, the 9/11 report, which was written by Ernie May and Phil Zelikow, they talk about the 9/11 attack was shocking, but not a surprise. And it said that the main problem there was lack of imagination. And what they should have said is a lack of historical imagination. We have been here before. And Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, later Secretary of State, said, well, we never imagined that terrorists would use weapons, or use airplanes as weapons. Well, I'm thinking, what about April 1945 when the Japanese unleashed 3,000 kamikaze pilots on the American fleet on the way to Japan? I mean, people use airplanes as suicide weapons all the time, and so I don't know what she's talking about. I mean, it's just this lack of imagination. And so I always kind of saw that. The other thing, too, is this. I grew up in the Midwest, in Chicago. And the Midwest has its own flavor, its own way of doing things. We've got our own poets. We've got our own literature. We've got our own working class type things. We've got our own heroes, etc. We're not East Coast, and we've always had a different way of looking at the world. And I've always imbibed that. I grew up in a neighborhood with blacks and Jews and Irish, lots of Irish, many of whom had committed crimes in Ireland and were former IRA who were hiding out in Chicago. So you learn about the cause right away from these guys. And so I grew up in an environment where I was exposed to lots of views, and then when I went to Colorado to go to university, there were fewer views to be exposed to. And so when I had an opportunity to study in Vienna in 64, 65, I jumped at it. And so this kid from Chicago, via Colorado, hops on the QE1, Pier 96 in New York, and I go off to New York, I go off to Vienna the same week the Beatles had come to America. And there I studied comparative communist systems. I wanted to be the great explainer of communism, since that was the main thrust of American foreign policy, anti-communism. And so I traveled as much as I could. I went to the Eastern Bloc on weekends, East Berlin, Budapest, Prague, all the rest of it. And I wanted to see the Soviet Bloc, Soviet Union close up. And I could see, even as a young man, they didn't have anything I wanted. And I also could see as a young man, they couldn't get a price point on anything. It was always kind of lopsided, skewed. Anyway, I became an expert in comparative communist systems. And then in 1991, when the Soviet flag comes down, nobody studies communism anymore. And then when we have troubles with China and Russia. People don't know what's going on. Well, first of all, they're good communists. And what I like about communists is they think like communists. Communists are not, they might lie and cheat, but they don't use rhetoric. They mean what they say. And so I became a student of comparative communism when I was younger. And I could see, for example, this rise of China today. They talk about a new Cold War. I got news for you. The old Cold War didn't end. It started in 1949. It's going. The problem is that China's not rising. It's the Communist Party which is falling. That is, they see the party having a life of about 70 years, which coincides, incidentally, with the life of a dynasty in China. There are 249 dynasties in China, and they have an average life of 70 years. So, Xi Jinping and his people, they're worried about being eclipsed by history. They're worried about the students in Hong Kong because they see them as the counter-revolution. Well, I understand all this. I can talk with these people. I know what they think. But we have people in government today who don't have a clue about comparative communist systems. They don't know how it works. And worse yet, they don't even know what language it takes place in. I had dinner last night with federal police through a friend, and they're all counterterrorism. And so I gave them all a lesson that they didn't want to hear. That when you're looking at communism or the rise of terrorism in Australia, you're looking at a very old phenomenon. And I said, if you understood the Bader Meinhof gang or the Red Brigade in Italy or the Shining Light in Peru, you'd understand how these people work. Even if you understood the mind of the IRA. I said, there is a typology and a pathology of terrorism that's always been out there. I said, but of course, that would require you learning German or Italian and getting over your hang-ups. I mean, the Italians haven't had a major attack on Italian soil since 1978 when they broke the back of the Red Brigade. And why is that? Because the Italians made sure that they got the information they wanted. And I said, and I said to these people, I said, Australians would have to say, hey, these wogs got it right, but we'd have to study Italian. We don't study Italian. Shit, German's too hard. We don't do that. So we're just going to pretend that we're discovering everything every day. So I said, you're behind the 8 ball. I said, there is a literature out there, a scientific literature, on who these people were and what motivates them, and it's all about neurons. It's all about neuroscience. And they looked at me like I'm crazy. These guys, they're averaging $170,000 a year. They're spinning their wheels. They're no closer to understanding terrorism than they were 2-3 years ago. And so they don't have a historian nearby. They don't have any historical thing. And I think when I met you, I think the thing that struck me was, what I was interested in their invitation, was that in this country, in the last 30 years, Australians have become less curious about the world, and what they know about the world, they're ahistorical. They don't know any history, in fact, but they act like they do. And so these people become dangerous. I always say to my students over 48 years, be careful who you vote for, or you get you killed. Well, Lyndon Johnson got us killed. Richard Nixon got us killed. Jimmy Carter was trying to get us killed. Ronald Reagan got us killed. People say, we had this wonderful peaceful period after 45. Well, not in Cambodia or Vietnam or Korea. I mean, there was fierce wars going on. People forget the proxy wars that were going on because we did not meet each other on the battlefield because we knew what the cost was. The cost was nuclear war. Anyway, I'm not a genius about this. All I have is a historical sense of how the world works. And when I see fewer kids study history, and Australians and Americans less and less interested in the study of history, I'm thinking, well, this does not bode well for the future because we're sort of guessing, we're feeling our way. We might get through it, we might not. People also, because they don't know any history, they think history is linear. They think this is this one great story. Well, I got news for you. The history of Australia is not written in stone, and nor is the United States.
I mean, for all of us, right? History for all. I mean, you mentioned nuclear weapons earlier, and maybe we can get into a bit of eschatology right now, so at the end of days. And I mean, one thing that I always like to think of is Carl Jung. He talked about how technological advancements are always increasing, But if we don't match those technological advancements with equal wisdom, then they're going to get too far ahead of us, and they come around and bite us in the back, right? But now we've got technology that is, like you say, nuclear weapons that can just wipe us all out. And so there's such an intensity in this moment. Where, with your understanding, I don't know, do you think that we can make it through the next 100 years, without something catastrophic happening like that?
Well, I've always argued that the reason we've not had a general nuclear war is because we have a standoff between the nuclear powers. Gareth Evans, the famous foreign minister in this country, was always pushing nuclear reforms, non-proliferation. He argued with me that it's only been dumb luck. Not really. That's what you say when you don't know anything. And of course, Australia wants a bet each way. It wants to be under the American atomic umbrella and be the leader in nuclear non-proliferation. Well, you can't have it both ways because people is what you're talking about. And I think today, what makes the world really dangerous is not only the weapons of mass destruction out there, but this artificial intelligence that's coming to be able to deliver these weapons. You no longer need a million pounds, a megaton weapon to destroy an airport in Philadelphia. All you need to bring in is a Predator drone with a Hellfire missile that has a very small nuclear weapon there, which can destroy. So you can get smaller and smaller weapons. And I always worried about, of course, these smaller weapons are called tactical nuclear weapons. And Simon, they've never been counted. In all the great arms control deals we had, no one counted tactical nuclear weapons. When people want to pick a fight with Putin, I think, well, he's got 6,000 nuclear weapons, major weapons, strategic nuclear weapons. That's 1,750 legally, and the rest are on the shelf, which you can reprogram in 15 minutes. And he's got thousands of tactical nuclear weapons, and he's threatened those. He actually told Macron, you bug me, and things are going to happen. We're all going to be screwed. And so,
how do they even count those weapons? Like, what would be the process? And I mean, they can't possibly.
Well, strategic nuclear weapons usually are in the ground somewhere, or they're delivered by air, or delivered by submarines. So you're sort of. And back in the day, we used to measure throw weight and all these technical things. But they are very large missiles. Then we started miniaturizing things, and we put them on cruise missiles. In fact, the reason that North Korea pauses is when you got all these Ohio and Virginia class submarines showing up on your doorstep, and they all have 220 missiles. And they could be nuclear armed in 10 minutes, and they take out the place. That's why these guys get very, very nervous. But I think it's the AI. We're not paying much attention to this. Yeah. I don't mean machines taking over the world. People who say that too, but I'm talking about the delivery systems. It's a lot easier to blow up a place. And with nuclear weapons, it's not just using them, it's threatening to use them. Because if I have a nuclear weapon, and you're a neighbor, you're going to get a nuclear weapon. And this produces a multiplier effect. Everybody wants a nuclear weapon. Now, there was a French general who argued in 1960, and I sort of adhere to him a little bit, who argues that the spread of nuclear weapons is not more dangerous. It makes the world a safer place because it checkmates everybody. The Pakistanis and the Indians and the Chinese and the Russians and the Americans. And so he said the spread of nuclear weapons might be more beneficial. Not everywhere, but might be more beneficial. So, but that's not considered doable anymore. I think it's very relative. And a lot of people belong to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Club. They've given up the right still nuclear weapon in exchange for nuclear technology. And General Gawa says, how could any nation expect another nation to guarantee their survival with their nuclear weapons, not your own? He said it's a very selfish act to ask your neighbor not to have the weapon that you have. If you don't believe me, you ask Colonel Gaddafi, or Saddam, who didn't have nuclear weapons, who became the poster boys for what happens when you don't have a nuclear weapon. Chairman Kim in North Korea is a good example of what you can do if you have a nuclear weapon, is that people treat him quite differently. So when Putin has a legitimate complaint, and he's got 6,000 strategic weapons, thousands of tactical weapons, and we treat him like some third-rate punk from Iraq, we're in trouble, because superpowers do not bluff, and you don't ever want to paint them in that corner. Yeah. And people say, oh, nuclear war will never happen. Actually, that's stupid. It can happen, and we've been damn lucky it hasn't happened since 45. And there are, 9 nuclear powers today. There could be 15 on Monday morning because people have the technology, they can buy them off the shelves, and they have, most importantly, the missile technology to deliver them. That's why Israel is always very nervous. It's worried about its neighbors having the ability to take out Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, that kind of thing. But anyway, I was interested. I was always interested in history because I could see the importance of it. And and I got really lucky when I was young. I started to meet famous people. I didn't know they were famous. Arnold Toynbee, and Hans Kohn, the great master of nationalism, and Karl Popper. I had a seminar with him.
And who's Karl Popper?
Karl Popper was a refugee from Central Europe who turned out to be a very famous modern philosopher. Karl Popper. And he was bloody famous, but I didn't know that. He was only in his 60s. And taking a course in philosophy. Now, the only other course I'd taken was metaphysics. And I was drowning in metaphysics. I just drowned. So I had the Popper course.
Yeah.
Because I thought the great advantage of a university education was to expose yourself to the great minds.
Yeah.
Which is why I don't like online education. Online doesn't expose you to anything. Expose you to...
Yeah, it's certainly not ideal.
Wow. It actually... It kills it. It's just... Who would pay, $1,000 to go to a Rolling Stones concert and then watch it on TV, or YouTube? No one does that. Yeah. Anyway, I had Popper. And
well, I'm certainly in the category of fools at the moment. I'm studying the Master of Divinity online, and it's certainly not ideal. There's something just about being here, in the same way that being here with you, there's a certain energy to this.
Well, there's a chemistry there that you never forget. So I'm in Popper's classroom, and some wag says to him, why do we even study philosophy? What do you do? And Popper says, the idea of philosophy is to throw a brick through a window and let in some fresh air. And I thought, he's right, of course. That's the idea of philosophy. You let in the fresh air.
Can I say something about that? You've told me this before, and I love that. I love that idea, and I have to tell you something that Sharon LaBelle said to me the other day. She's one of my kind of co-founders of the Walled Garden, and she said to me, Simon, I think rather than education as the thing that we're doing here with the Walled Garden, it's more provocation. Where we're trying to provoke people to get outside of the boxes that they're currently sitting in, and you might say let in some fresh air, see something from a different perspective.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, what is it? Einstein says that we only use about 1% of our brain. Yeah. And he's right. And the other thing too is that I think there are more people interested in what you have to offer than we let on. That is, this idea that you can't study theology or history or philosophy without university preparation does not hold up to me, because in my lifetime, I was born in 1944, I met a lot of people who were really smart. I didn't go to university, but I think you start to learn as a kid that uneducated people are not unintelligent. They're very intelligent. And they got all kinds of And they're hungry. People are hungry. This is why they join cults. That's why they join the brigades or the militias. That's why they join the Republican Party. They're hungry for something that explains the world around them. And any new idea that comes in. Remember when I was a kid, Ayn Rand stuff came out. Everybody got hooked on it. Atlas Shrugged. Stuff like that. And at the end of the day, it wasn't all that convincing. And then we got the big hit from Sartre and the existentialists and that kind of thing. I love it today when politicians say that this issue is an existential issue in Russia, Ukraine, Poland, America. It's existential. Actually, the only existential proposition out there was for the dinosaurs. We haven't had an existential. Yeah, you can unleash 10 nuclear weapons. We're not going to disappear. Life will diminish. But we haven't reached the existential state yet. If climate change goes sideways tomorrow, and the water rises 2, 3, 4 feet, well, the rich people will go to higher ground, and the poor people will survive somehow. The way they do in Bangladesh, in the borderlands.
Going back to that principle that you talked about, the powerful will do what they can.
Well, that's right. I mean, every political scientist who claims to be important begins with that dialogue on wheels. Let the powerful do what they can, and the less powerful do what they must. And nothing's changed. Nothing is changing in human nature. God knows we've tried to impose different ways of thinking on people. But look, we've got to figure out some way, and I think you're very smart, since people are not going to be rushing to universities to study history or international history. They have to find other ways to access the great ideas. Now, in this country, when they want to bring the great ideas into universities, the left wing knocked it back, saying it was all about feminism, patriarchy, racism. They don't know what they're talking about. I mean, when you study history or antiquity, you study it on its own terms. We don't bring our values to it. It's called moral relativism. And it's a sucker's bet, because you never go anywhere. We're going to judge everything by our standards today. We learn nothing, absolutely nothing. Yeah. And so Australian universities, with one exception, I think, rejected that $25 million that they were trying to give away just to bring the great books back into universities. I remember when I was younger.
They rejected, you said, $25 million?
At least, to reintroduce Western Civ courses, the great books.
That's right, I heard about that.
Oh, that was a big deal because all the academics, left-wing academics argued that this was just post-colonial crap, and it was a con job, and they don't know what they're talking about. I mean, this is just, I hate to say this, I mean, I've been in Australian education for 40 years, and there's a great deal of ignorance that goes on in the name of whatever, whether it's Marxism, and they argued that there's nothing to be learned from the great books because it's about patriarchy, it's racism, and it's like these people who want to topple statues in America. Can you think of anything more futile than that? To knock over a statue. I mean, you can go right through the Roman Forum and knock over statues, but you're not going to know any more about the Roman Forum, how it got there. Yeah. And it seems to me that what is linear is not history, but the human spirit. Because, you could get ancient civilizations, and you could get plagues and locusts and Nazis and communists to kill the mind. But they always come back. They come back in one form or another.
That human spirit always finds a way to emerge.
In America in the 40s and 50s, Americans were hooked on Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian, who had his own radio show. They got hooked on a very famous Catholic speaker I remember listening to. They were turning to theology and religion as sort of an insight into the future. And of course, that fell by the wayside. It was seen as too religious for the seculars. So they tried to replace it with something else. And I just think, when I look at the world stage, there's kind of a numbness and darkness out there. We can go back to St. Anna if you want to. If you don't know your history, you're going to repeat it, etc. But these people are in a dangerous spot. These are people that are going to get you killed.
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense to me. And the thing is that if the body politic understands that the leaders are wrong, people, sometimes leaders, they do things that are at odds with the body politic. They think that, being hard on America or China or Russia is the thing to do, but they don't realize they lose these wars in the short term, and they will lose these wars. The body politic will force these governments to sign surrender terms, the likes of which they could never have imagined. These people are they're taking entire civilizations into the unknown. Now, the thing that impressed me about Australia when I arrived, I think there were about 14 million people here. Now there are about 26 million. And a landmass the size of the continental United States, with borders of 12,500. I just know the Rear Admiral who's in charge of Border Patrol. So he's got 56 ships. He's in charge of 12,500 miles of coastline. Good luck with that one. and so there are many things about Australia that are accidents, historical accidents. It wouldn't be here unless if the Brits could continue to send their troublesome Irishmen to the New World, there would be no Australia. So Australia is an interesting place, this laboratory, on the fringe of Asia. Well, there's nothing natural about it. There's nothing natural about Asians thinking Australians are a little strange, as a matter of fact. But for many years, Australians learned the languages, and they were interlocutors, and a lot of Westerners depended on Australia to explain Southeast Asia to them. That's not so much so now, because people don't want to listen to much. Sometimes you see in these American broadcasts or congressional hearings, you see these really strange people who are introduced as the senior advisor of the National Security Council for Ukraine or Russia. These are people you ain't never heard of, who've never written the cutting-edge books in the field. These are people who have opinions, and they pass themselves off as experts. And they're going to kill you, I tell you. I heard two of these people, the former ambassador to Russia, a guy named William Taylor, saying that Putin has blinked. No. And then Fiona Hill, who's the Russian expert in the Security Council before Trump, she argues that we have to call his bluff. Well, what are these people talking about? This guy's got 6,000 nuclear weapons. And if we push him in a corner, he's going to use them. I'd use them, When you get one more throw of the dice, you don't fool around, you launch. People don't realize how close we are. Now, there is a way for people to judge us. When the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists put out their first issue in the late 40s, I think the atomic clock was, 5 minutes to midnight or something like that. Today, the atomic clock is 100 seconds to midnight. That's how close we are to the end. And yet, you look at the news and what this politician said about somebody in the lead. I mean, they're sort of filling their days with nothing. Because it's hard to think about the great problems. And Australia has to figure out how to position itself between America, which doesn't always do the right thing, and China, which doesn't always do the right thing. And it's very hard to have an independent foreign policy when you're caught between the giants. But yet, America did in 1800. It was caught between France and Britain, declared independence, took a lashing by both of them. And there was no American treaty, peacetime treaty between 1800 and 1949, NATO, because Americans avoided entangling alliances like the plague, because they didn't want to be suckered into somebody's war. So, when you think, I've written, make sure you get this book, Understanding Presidential Doctrine. Originally, the Americans were concerned about the tension between having a place in the world and not being dragged into it. It's a constant navigating. And then you get Joe Biden the other day say that America will defend every inch of NATO territory. It's 30 countries. And I'm thinking, would America be prepared to lose Los Angeles, New York, or Chicago for Minsk, Warsaw? See, this is not going to happen.
Yeah.
This is a con. The only guy who could see through this was de Gaulle. He knew Americans would never trade Chicago for Paris. So that's why he wanted his own nuclear deterrent. Because you can't ask someone to protect you. He thought it was, his word was unmanly because you can't use it anymore. But he didn't think it was proper, appropriate. And so now we're promising to protect every inch of 30 countries. And what I don't understand is there are 149 million Russians with a gross national product about the size of Italy. And there are 449 million European people in Europe with the third highest economy in the world. They count on the United States to defend them. So this doesn't make any sense. I've been among these people in conferences over the last couple of years. They're completely dependent on America to call the shots. Well, if I got 449 people behind me, I don't need somebody else. I can make a decision. But they don't want to do the hard thing. But anyway, we're getting off subject. The point is that I've always brought to these discussions what has happened in the past. And I'm always interested in how we got to this point. And you cannot solve a problem unless you understand how you got to this point.
So how do we get here? Well, let me ask you this. I want to ask that question. Okay. And I also want to ask, if people are looking for a specific time period that they might study to get a good overall picture of perhaps what we're looking at right now in our world, is there anything that stands out to you as a time period?
Absolutely. The diplomatic origins of the First World War.
Okay.
This explains what's going on right now.
Have you written a book about that?
Yes, in my, I got a little book with Oxford, which is now in its second edition. It started out called Diplomacy. They changed the title to Diplomatic History. Same book, revised. And the first chapter is about how diplomacy begins. And the second chapter is the diplomatic origins of the First World War. It was a period of time in which it was the heyday of peace movements. Economies were connected all over. Families were connected all over the world. And yet we went to war. And how did this happen? That's what people have to understand. And there was all this running around at the last minute to get the Russians, the Tsar to do things differently, or Imperial Germany, etc. And at the end of the day, what happened was, we get Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is the prototype of the European Union. 16 languages spoken, been around for hundreds of years. Challenging people in Slavs in Bosnia, who were closely associated to terrorists in Belgrade, the kingdom of Serbia. And the Austrians decided first to annex the territory and then to crush them. But they couldn't do it without the German allies. And the Germans gave the Austrians a blank check. Franz Joseph had been through many wars and lost all of them. He was too old to resist, and he just left it to them, the other guys. And so the War Cabinet gave the Austrians the green light. And they're worried about one day there'll be too many Slavs. They're worried about losing their time in history. The moment, this is the moment. And what people don't realize is that these are ordinary human beings who decide to throw the dice. They roll the dice, and they have no damn idea how this is going to turn out.
Yeah.
So the first thing you learn from the First World War is the law of unintended consequences. you can go out there and do everything you want, and it's all going to wind up. I mean, just think about it. These 4 great empires all go to war. Hohenzollerns in Austria-Hungary. You've got the Romanovs. You've got the Habsburgs in Austria-Hungary, and the Hohenzollerns in Germany, and then you got the Romanovs. And at the end of the war, they're all gone. I mean, they all disappeared. They all went to war to shore up their positions, and of course the Ottoman Turks disappear. The British Empire is okay for a while, but all the empires that went to war, who made the decision, were complicit in their own demise. So you have to be very careful about what you think you're doing.
Yeah.
And but the activity, all the diplomatic activity. Now, people don't understand diplomacy. They think it's sitting down and getting shafted by somebody, or being bluffed, or compromising. Diplomacy is not a compromise. It's about, as I say in my book, it's about getting a little more than your position allows and never less than your position requires. It's about leverage. You know, when Putin surrounds Ukraine with 170,000 troops, he's got all the leverage. So we say to him, if you attack Ukraine and kill about 50,000 people, we're going to close down your credit cards and your bank account. Take that. Well, it's a little bloody late to save 50,000 people. Mention another 200,000 more injured. I mean, it just comes too late. It's too late. That's why we have to compromise. And you can't have Europe without Russia. And NATO was only designed to contain the Soviet Union. And Putin is right. After 1997, American presidents started letting people into NATO like it was a frequent flyer planes. Let them on the flight. And you get all these nations that don't belong in NATO because NATO's lost its mission. And in 1991, when the Cold War was over, or even 1989, the French President Mitterrand says it's time to close down NATO. But why can't you close down NATO? Because they all wear the uniforms, they've got buildings, they've got pension programs, medical plans. It's an industry.
Yeah, it's an industry now.
And they keep spreading without a reason. There is no reason. And when people say, Stoltenberg, this head of NATO, says we pose no threat to Russia, it's not how they say it. I mean, because they're aimed at Russia. And of course, there are encampments in Poland and I think Romania that have missile bases that could take out Soviet missiles and airplanes. This is what Putin's worried about. He's worried about the same thing that John Kennedy was worried about, losing the nuclear balance power. And so everyone thought the Cuban Missile Crisis was the ideal example of how to get out of these things. Today, people say, oh, this is just about the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine to choose. Well, when we get around to Taipei or Taiwan, we're not going to even have that discussion because even though they are independent, they're not in the United Nations. So they don't have any jurisdiction. In other words, this is a very bad example. And of course, I always point out, Austria, Finland, and Sweden are all independent, doing well, and they're all neutral. You have to have, in these borderlands, neutral zones, so as not to pose a threat. And we don't seem to think that's a legitimate concern. So I've been arguing around the world that he has a legitimate concern. We're not admitting the legitimate concern. He had 3 concerns: expansion of NATO, NATO in Ukraine, and the deployment of first-strike weapons on Ukraine's borders, which are 3 to 5 minutes away from Moscow. They're all legitimate concerns. And so we all argue that he is the provocateur here, the aggressor. He's just talking to us in the language of force, which is the only thing the West understands, because that's what we use against the Soviet Union and everybody else. And so he's got a legitimate complaint. But if you sit down with someone and you say you have a legitimate complaint, you might have to listen. So what you get is a chorus from Americans and European foreign ministers who all go to Moscow or call him up and say, you know, you can't do this, you can't do that. He doesn't know what they're talking about because they haven't considered his complaint. His complaint is this tips the nuclear balance. Now, this course makes me a realist, which makes me an oddball, actually. Most people say, oh, realism, it's about spheres of influence. You're damn right it's about spheres of influence. That's his neighborhood. There is a very famous book in 1940, which has a very famous chapter. It's called The Doctrine of Propinquity. If it's in your neighborhood, that's your red line.
That's I don't even know that word.
Propinquity means nearness.
Propinquity, okay.
The nearby.
Nearness, okay. Yeah.
Some guy, Johns Hopkins, wrote this book. The Doctrine of Propinquity. And I always say to people, and I've said it out there, that if you had Russian battalions in Canada across the Niagara Falls from New York, or you had Russian battalions in Mexico across the Rio Grande from El Paso, we'd be at war tomorrow morning. Can't have foreign forces in your neighborhood. It's just not conducive to a peaceful resolution. And so we've done this. He's doing this to prove to us that this is his red line. And I don't care who it is. This is his red line.
So, if I could
Sure.
just to sum up, so a lot of what I'm hearing you say is, okay, so we've got widespread general ignorance about, say, the patterns of history, about how these things come about. You've got people in very powerful positions who don't know what they're talking about. You've got organizations that have become so big that they are the industry themselves, but they've done too little at this stage, and it's kind of got out of hand. And you're kind of watching out for this moment when somebody decides to roll the dice.
Yes.
And that's when everything starts to go in that
Well,
big
the
chain
big winner here is the military-industrial complex, both in Russia and the United States and other places.
Which we were talking about earlier.
They don't lose any. They don't lose any money on this.
Yeah.
And they're fed by greed and ambition. God bless them all. But that's what capitalism is. People imagine that America is some Santa Claus or Christian charity. America is, from the beginning, a business civilization. That's how it works. We're talking about proto-capitalists. And so when Americans talk like business and they want to keep an open-door world so America can ply its trade, whether it's industrial or commercial trade, they want equity, they want access to these things. It's about an open door.
Access. You talked to me about that before. That's
access.
What they want. Access.
They want access.
Yeah.
And they use this claim about democratizing the world. Democratizing simply means I'm coming after you. Because if I democratize your neighbor, what I'm talking about is regime change. And this is what happened after the Cold War. A lot of the neocons thought we'd won the Cold War. We didn't win the Cold War. Soviets collapsed. The Cold War was about the end of the nuclear arms race. And that was done by Gorbachev and Praeger. After that, the Soviets collapsed on their own weight. And so people argue, well, we beat the Soviets, it's time to sell democracy to the Middle East, and then we'll just keep going. So America sends out armies to democratize the world. The way the Romans sent out armies to gain a reputation for the next guy. It's pretty simple. You want influence. You show people you're a big shot because you've conquered Gaul. You got cachet back home. And so we sent out armies to democratize the world. That's what we were doing in Afghanistan, and Iraq, and Libya. And we failed miserably in all those places because American democracy is not a blueprint for the world. It doesn't latch on to the conditions, etc.
It's like Guinness, it doesn't travel.
That's right, it doesn't travel. It doesn't travel. In fact, last night when I was talking to all these counterterrorism people, I was drinking Guinness, and I kept thinking about the young lady historian said from Ireland that it just doesn't travel very well. Yeah. Now, I've been in this country for 48 years, and public discussion about these issues has just sort of dropped off. We don't see a lot of public intellectuals. That's kind of a pretentious phrase. These are people who just explain it. They're kind of replaced by Fox News types who have an axe to grind. Now, there's a lot of guys on the left, brilliant people I know, who have said nothing for the past 20 years because they reckon as post-colonialists that the capitalists, the former colonial powers, can stew in their own juice. They're waiting for their time for Marxism to rise again. So they've said nothing. And most universities in this country are center left. And of course, there are no right-wing universities.
Yeah.
It's not possible.
I looked at Harvard the other day. I think it was something like 80% are either left, of the professors are either left or far left. I think it was 2-point-something% of professors at Harvard identified as Republican or
right. Yeah, there's never been that kind of place. In fact, what's interesting about the Trump administration is there wasn't a single Harvard intellectual who was invited into the Trump administration, or a single person from Brookings, which is kind of the center link for Democrats when they're waiting for the next administration.
Yeah.
They weren't invited.
You want people who are going to tell you what you want to hear. Let me ask you a couple of things here, because, okay, so you say everybody's got an axe to grind. One thing that I notice about your way of thinking is it's almost kind of like a Machiavellian sort of sit back and watch humans for what they are. Not making any kind of moral judgments about, well, this is good, this is bad, but just saying, this is what's happening, this is what we're like.
Well, yeah.
But everybody today has an axe to grind, and part two to that question is, you also mentioned, say, Marxism, which is, of course, somewhat a step in the direction of a communist way of politics. And one thing I've noticed is that Marxists tend to be really good at organizing. It's part of the philosophy. I've seen 2 people already here in Melbourne. We've been here for a day and a half. I've seen 2 people handing out Marxist, pamphlets and posters, and
they're very good at grassroots.
They're very good at it. And so, everybody's got their axe to grind. Everybody's falling into these tribes, and one of those tribes is certainly this Marxist movement. Do you think that, do you think that the West is really in danger of that taking over again, or do you think it's a whole bunch of a lot of ado about nothing?
If we fail, I think we're in danger of moving further to the right.
Yeah.
So the far right and the far left got one thing in common: they don't think much of the individual.
Yeah.
They dump on them, and they're contemptuous of authority. That is, unless it's their authority. And the far left and the far right believe that there's only one truth. And see, as soon as you get into that zero-sum game, you've already been suckered into the wrong place. You either agree with me or you don't agree with me. I remember seeing a historical sequence once, a movie where communists rounded up all these people in Vietnam, and somebody said, "You killed a lot of good communists there." They said, "Well, it's the price you pay. You kill a lot of your own people, and you got to kill the opposition." I think we're a little more in danger of moving further to the right. Now, the right's pleasant, if you're part of it, etc. But what I see in the world, I've seen this since a kid. We are more people than we thought we were going to be. When I was younger, Paul Ehrlich's book was about overpopulation. He was saying 4 billion was too much. Now we're nearly 8 billion. And when the climate change theories came out, we talked about all these emissions. But Vice President Gore failed to mention that we're more people. He didn't have that on his chart. We're more people. And so as soon as you want to talk about population control, a lot of people argue, you can't do anything like that. And American government forbids the handing out of condoms or advice, that kind of stuff. We're in a funny world where population, you get all this pressure on resources. I think we're reaching a point where the difference between the haves and the have-nots is so great that we are going to become numb to what happens next. I mean, before all this Ukraine business, or the Iran deal, etc., Yemen was sliding into disaster. Afghanistan is in disaster. There are about 37 million people in the world today who have to change locales overnight. And we've got a lot of people who are hungry. And we got a lot of people displaced. And where are they going to go? Good question. That's a really good question. And they're going to go wherever, in the past, they were just tribes that moved. And sometimes they predominated, sometimes they didn't. And so we've got this great movement of people again who are going to look for some safety. You know, and people ain't stupid. They're just going to go to terra firma and a little bit of food, etc. So we have all these disasters, and we're becoming inured to these things. You know, the nice thing, interesting thing about social media is we get to see poverty and racism and violence close up. But at the end of it, we're kind of numb.
Yeah. I feel that myself. I think it was best put by Louis C.K. He has this great bit in one of his... Actually, it might have been some other comedian. I bet it was. But essentially, this bit he was saying, you know, I watch the news and I really want to care. You know, but he just says, at the end of the day, and I think that a lot of people are like that. And I think that we sometimes pretend. But if you really think about it, seeing so much of it, and I want you to continue that thought, but I also want to ask, you know, you say the left, the right, far left, far right, they have this thing in common that they don't really care too much for the individual. And I think that this in part touches on the reason why, one of the reasons why I've wanted to study theology. I feel as though so many of the issues that we face today are theological, you know, dealing with aims. What is most important to you? What is most valuable to you? Certainly the narrative of Christ is focusing on the individual as the centerpiece of the thing that brings people together, is that focus on the individual and the sovereignty of the individual. But I would love to hear from you what you think the role of, say, theology, or I know what you believe about the role of history, but philosophy, theology, how do you think these play a role in bringing people together? Well, I think
theology is important because it puts up those moral and ethical guardrails that we don't seem to have.
Yeah.
You know, if you don't study for moral philosophy, and you don't know who these people are, you know there should be some fairness out there. You don't know there are referees in football and baseball and ice hockey and all the rest of it. But we don't know that there are things in us that could lead us to the same conclusion. What I like about theology is it teaches self-control. When people say, you know, what's self-control? That is where you do not reach out for things that are going to hurt people, whether it's more money, sex, drugs, or rock and roll, it's a power. And there are limits.
Also yourself, right? You don't go to things that are going to hurt you. Look, we're sitting in a mall right here, and one of the things that I so often see in places like these big malls is, every shop, the advertisements, it's like more, you know, drop those inhibitions, have what you want, you know, do what you want to do, you know, screw the opinions, it's, I like what you say about those moral guardrails.
Well, I was on Chinese Beijing radio the other night, and they were fascinated about what's going on in Canada.
Yeah, I want to talk about that too.
This is the same issue. I said, look, the Canadian protests are similar to the American protests. Aside from the pandemic fatigue, I said, Canada is a nation of people who are raised as individuals. I said, it is harder to impose collective rules on individual-oriented people than it is people who grow up thinking as collectives. So it's a lot easier, and I said this in Asia, a lot easier to impose the rules like COVID-0 on communist countries or Asian countries that think about the group instead of the individual. The Americans are going crazy, and a lot of Australians, because they think as individuals. They don't think they have an obligation to anybody else. And so you have the individual versus the collective view of things. And that's going to be one of the issues years ahead. As an individual, you don't know this, but in the 1990s, the United Nations issued a directive called R2P, Responsibility to Protect. And that is, it said that the international community, whatever that is, has a responsibility to protect the individual when the state can no longer protect them, either from harm or other things. That we have an obligation to step in. Now, that's been slightly discredited because we haven't done a very good job. But R2P is a big doctrine. It's part of the United Nations. It has been extended into this Sustainable Development Goals, which now talks about the responsibility of the world to erase poverty by the year 2040. And if you and I were putting a tender into the Indian government or Bangladeshi government, we'd have to talk about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Now in Australia, who talks about that? Nobody. The rest of the world is working on this because they see an obligation to protect the individual, whether the governments of the day don't want to do it or not. And that comes from their long-held Christian, Buddhist, whatever beliefs, that you are responsible for the guy next to you. You bring him in.
So in other words, the international community, if, let's say, they see communism sweeping in a more collectivist approach that kind of wipes out the sovereignty of the individual, they're trying to say that the international community has a responsibility to step in and stop that from happening.
Yes, and to stay with the same metaphors, the international community has an obligation to resist the privatization of violence. That's what's taken place in the last decade.
What do you mean?
Privatization of violence. Whereas violence can be practiced by governments. Governments can say, go out there and kill the enemy, then you get a medal. But you and I can't go out there and kill the enemy unless we're wearing a uniform.
Okay.
But on the other hand, if we become terrorists, whether it's the IRA or the PLO or ISIS or Al-Qaeda, we have assumed for ourselves the right to commit violence on behalf of what we think is important. Okay? This is the privatization of violence.
Okay.
This is where the individual reaches the point where they will act. And that's what governments around the world can agree on, that individuals shouldn't have this possibility. You've got to stop them. But it's hard to stop them, because when people reach that point, that threshold, they're up against the whole system. And that's the point where you're either with me or against me, kind of thing. And so you got the privatization of violence. But the international community, I'm talking about the United Nations, has thought very carefully about the individual. And the United Nations, I think, is built on not only great precedents, but it's built on the great religions too. I mean, people in the United Nations, they come from belief systems that believe they have an obligation to do no harm. That's what it's all about. Look at the end of communism, how quickly the whole of Russia went back into the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, today you can't be a leader in Russia without looking like a devout follower of the Russian. Well, where the hell did that happen? During the Cold War, there was no religion. Not exactly, because you can't. It's in the DNA.
This is something that my brother kind of turned me on to. Was he just pointed out to me, have a think about the fact that nations, when they're forming, they'll actually try to decide which religion do we want as the governing religion. And of course there's natural ways of that kind of flowing in, but he was pointing to Russia specifically, sitting down and saying, okay, which one do we feel is, and there's going to be a political tinge to the Christianity that has over there, that they have over there, of course, but how does that work? You're talking about Russia moving in an Orthodox Christian way. How does that?
Well,
is that theological diplomacy happening? Where they go?
Before the great traditional religions came in, there was the multiple theistic societies. You look at these great episodes of the fall of civilization. They worshipped this god and that god, and god of rain, and god of regeneration. Everybody had these gods. So it's built in the DNA that we're looking for something.
Yes.
We're looking for something.
I think that's one of the most important things that anybody could realize is that no matter what you think about religion as a whole, it's in our DNA, it's in our biology since the dawn of time to be looking for something above ourselves, something of which we are a part of.
And look at all the high priests of Aztecs and Incas and pre-Columbian religions. They all had a job. And the Egyptians were masters at slavery and everything else. And yet, these people spend all this money on creating a place for the afterlife. I mean, that afterlife looks a little screwy to me. But it's part of that DNA, that there has to be something on the other side. And I think, wow, God does not interfere in free will. I think he does. Since we're all created in his likeness, I think we all pick up the DNA that there is something there. Now, we could deny it all our lives. I always get a kick out. There are conferences around the world on atheism. They have these British philosophers show up, famous politicians, and people pay all this money to talk about there is no God. Who gives a shit what they think? These people, you know, these are diners on the Titanic, as far as I'm concerned. I want nothing to do with them. When someone says to me, a great politician, academic, you know, I don't believe in God, I say, so what? You know, I had one guy come and talk about the morality of politics, a left-wing guy, talked to my class, which was called, by the way, Global History, Technology, and Security. And he's talking about morality, and he says to this large class, he said, I want you to know I don't believe in God, but I believe in morality. So I said to him later, I said, nice lecture. I said, but completely unnecessary comments. I said, first of all, I don't give a shit about what you believe in. It means nothing to me. You know, if you want to go down the dark road, go down the dark road. But you don't tell the kids, I don't believe in anything. And then you tell them, well, you believe in morality. Where do you think you got that from? You know, you think you got that from the dirt that came off the ground? I mean, these people don't realize it's built into the system. And when I talk with people who don't believe in a higher being, I think I'm talking to the wall, you know. You know, some people go out of their way, and you know, people said for years, you know, religion doesn't mean anything anymore. And Tony Blair gave this brilliant seminar when he went to Yale after he left office. He predicted the rise, the resurgence of Islam, and the resurgence of religion around the world. He showed how about 90% of the world is committed to a religion. When we're all talking about a world without religion, I mean, because, you know, it seems to me that the religious aspect, I'm not talking about some Irish priest telling me what to do. I'm talking about the moral guardrails that we see coming up. And, you know, and this raises a very interesting point to me. Sometimes I see evil, and then some evil people might do some interesting, important things. So I once asked a theologian, can an evil person actually make positive contributions to the human spirit? Oh, I'm talking about after the Nazi experiments in World War II, the West glommed onto all this data.
They could start picking all their scientists up.
Well, they started cherry picking some of the stuff that worked. I mean, could a Nazi scientist or physician actually have discovered something important, something positive, come out of that mess? So I said to him, can evil people actually do something good? And could good people actually do something incredibly evil? You know, when the president lies to me about the Gulf of Tonkin, and we go into South Vietnam without any NATO allies, by the way, all 28 allies just said goodbye, you're on your own. We killed 58,000 Americans and 500 Australians, some South Koreans, and 2 million Vietnamese. We laid them in their graves, didn't even count them, and we left. This was an America that thought it was doing the right thing, the Christian thing, the whole deal. And all we did was leave evil in our wake. And I'm thinking, same thing with George W. Bush. He invented this weapons of mass destruction and led to all these wars, which killed hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million people, gave rise to real evil, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all the rest. And yet he claims to be a good born-again Christian. And then he went out, had the terrible things to say about President Trump. And in a perfect world, George W. Bush, his Secretary of Defense, and his Vice President would be tried as war criminals. They did was evil. They used this cover of darkness to impose democratization on a part of the world where the roots would not take place. People would say to me, well, you know, I kept asking Secretary of Defense, not Cheney, but the other guy, they said, did you do more harm than good? Well, he says we gave him a chance to make a decision. They made the wrong decision. Well, I don't think that's the point. The point is that we got a chance to do it. In other words, moral philosophy becomes very interesting because, you know, can a bad person actually achieve something? And can a good person actually do more evil than good? And I think that's why we study moral philosophy, to see what these, some of these things become very interesting.
What was his answer? Do you remember?
The answer?
To the question of can an evil person do good? And
well, he said you'd have to weigh the good and the bad.
Because when you talk about that, I'm thinking of that Nazi scientist who, I can't remember his name, but you know, he invented the nitrogen fertilizer, I believe, that pretty much opened up a whole world of food to people who previously hadn't had it, and agriculture basically saved humankind with that invention. But he also created the gas that they used in the chambers.
Well, I'm going to match that one with Werner von Braun, a good Nazi scientist, creating V-2 rockets, which killed innocent people without warning, becomes then the main fellow at NASA that gets us to the moon.
Yeah.
So we use Nazi science and their V-2 rockets and all the rest of it to get us to the moon. And
one of my brother's favorite people. You know, he talked not for the Nazi side, but just such an interesting story that they bring him over here, and then he becomes this American hero. You know, people love him for that.
And that's because we gave him a free pass.
Yeah.
And you know, the other thing too is that we get a little selective because the media now has been polarized. I knew Martin Luther King when we said hello, you know, when he was looking for students in Denver. But at the time he was looking for students, he'd kind of fallen out with the civil rights crowd because he was turning civil rights into the anti-war movement. And the civil rights mob, particularly Southern Christian people, didn't want him to move into anti-war. But he kept saying that the Vietnam War, which is killing more blacks per capita than any other race, is evil, and America is the most evil power in the world today. We have to stop this war. And he conflated the civil rights movement and the dignity of the individual with the Vietnam War. And they didn't want that. So, what do we know? We know that, like a good rock star, he had groupies in every city. And after a while, when he fell out with Lyndon Johnson, they started taping these motel rooms. So the guy's a philanderer. And it turns out that his scholars, those people working on his papers, found out that he plagiarized his theology thesis from Boston University. He's cheap. And yet today we have Martin Luther King Day, we have Martin Luther King streets everywhere. We forget all the things that he did wrong because we got very selective.
Well, shouldn't it be about weighing the balance?
Well, yeah, okay, but you never hear about what went wrong.
Yeah.
Now, in my business, if you and I cheat on our CV, we've lost our job. If it could be one line, you know, I reviewed a book I didn't review, or I went to a conference I didn't go to. People would say, well, he lied on his CVs. That's the golden standard.
Yeah.
This guy's thesis is plagiarized. It seems to me in the world of theology, you really can't plagiarize very much without getting caught.
Yeah.
I mean, because it'd be a small world, everybody would know everybody else. And so he cheated on his PhD, which in most cases would have been taken down from the web. So, but we don't hear it.
But it's
We get a free pass. Same thing with guys like Bill Clinton and John Kennedy. The morality of barn animals. We forget all of that. we want to figure out. So we have to be very selective. But I think it does raise that great issue about, as the world sort of falls into this kind of evilness, what do you do about it? And the other thing, too, is when the war on terror became big, and we decided to go after the bad guys, and I always argued, could have done something else, And 19 guys with box cutters take over 4 airplanes on the day. We could have called it a great crime, put yellow tape around it, prosecuted them. We'd have got them like we got the Huckabee bomber. Instead, we decided to militarize it and go charging off around the world without posse, coalition of will. I think we approached it the wrong way because we did all this damage in the meantime. The point is that when we legitimized the killing of terrorists, this is my beef with drones, is that we become the judge, jury, and executioner. We don't really know who else is there.
There's also such a distance.
Some guy in a trailer outside of Las Vegas initiates a drone. And it's like after the Kabul thing. We said we got the guy who exploded this bomb. All we did was kill 10 members of a family by accident. When they say it was by accident, I'm not buying that. It's just these drones make it easier to deliver the violence. They become less accountable for more. And by going after these people, we had literally given a free pass to Vladimir Putin to go after the Chechen terrorists or rebels. They were rebels, but then he called them terrorists. We gave a free pass to the Israelis to go after the Palestinian terrorists or rebels. We gave free passes to everybody. Everybody cleaned up their act by saying we're going after terrorists. Even today, the Ukrainians say that the separatists in the Donbass are not real separatists, they are terrorists. So that's how they're trying to clean it up by going after them. So we gave license to the world to go after people and ask questions later. Well, this raises all kinds of questions. Now, these are not good people. People who are trying to kill you, they get everything that's coming. But when we take out entire families without knowing for sure someone's in the room, we become a little too casual with collateral damage. In Vietnam, we had 2 million civilians killed in addition to all the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were killed. They were collateral damage. That's just too high. It gets a little on the crazy side. And the idea that the West can commit these crimes, and that's what they are, they're crimes, but they're considered, and they're pushed with lies, which we consider noble lies.
Yeah.
Governments can utter lies, and we all put up with it.
It goes back to Plato, right?
Yes.
The noble lie of a certain mythology, the story of the people that hopefully leads to. What's your bar? Well, okay, first let me ask you something. Can I get the time from you? Because I've got a date at 6 o'clock and I want to make sure I'm...
It's 4:45.
Okay, we're good.
We're good.
Okay, so I have to ask you, what's your line for a noble lie? What do you think that there is such a thing as an appropriate noble lie?
Okay, well, during the Second World War, before the United States entered the war, we had a ship in the Atlantic which was trailing a German submarine, and it was sunk. And we argued that the German submarine sank an innocent American submarine, just flying in the ocean. Franklin Roosevelt knew that was the lie, so he goes on the radio and he says, they killed these people for nothing, these rattlesnakes in the North Atlantic. And he was desperate to bring the Americans into the war before the British were taken out, because he could see the balance of power had changed. There would be Nazis all over South America. So he was desperate to get America into the war. And as much as he antagonized the Japanese, they still were not declaring war against the United States. As much as he antagonized the Germans, they wouldn't declare war against the United States. So he lied to the American people. In the interest of getting America into war. I think it was important to get America into war, to shed the isolationism for the larger prospect of defeating Nazi Germany. So that's the noble lie. He told a lie. But when you say that North Vietnamese torpedo boats tried to sink 2 American warships in the Gulf of Tonkin, who were in international waters, and they weren't. And they didn't actually shoot torpedoes that day, but the radar made a mistake. And you know it made a mistake. And you just say, well, American ships have been killed and shot in international waters, and so he institutes this thunderous bomb attack on North Vietnam. And that's the beginning of the war. That's just a lie. He wanted to get in. That's less noble. It's less noble in retrospect because Vietnam did not pose a serious threat. Now, I've seen some of the thinking in the Defense Department. They argue that getting involved in Vietnam was very important. 70% was to establish our reputation as a guarantor of nations. 20% was to keep out Chinese imperialists. And 10% was for the betterment of the South Vietnamese people. This idea of going to war so the government has a good reputation, that's Churchillian. That's crazy stuff. You know, people today, you see in these congressional interviews, we have to stand up to Putin because people has a reputation throughout the world. Actually, America has left people behind without losing its reputation. America cuts and runs when it gets a little expensive. It doesn't make any sense. We cut and run from Vietnam, didn't lose our reputation. We cut and run from Afghanistan. No one still wants to pick a fight with America. So it's not like about it. But the people start to imagine in Washington. It's because the people in Washington are just filled with this incredible hubris that their word is sacrosanct. Yeah, who says? Why? You know? And I think one of the great books written after the First World War, when Americans were debating whether to get involved in collective security, was rejected by the Senate twice. One of the great books was written by a fellow in the Midwest. It was called, Can America Stay Home? Can you actually operate in the world without sending out the legions? Now, America today has a couple 100,000 people overseas and 750 bases, forward bases, all looking forward to defeating the bad guys or advancing democracy. The way Julius Caesar wanted Gaul under his belt. You know, we're sending out armies to democratize the world. And the world is kind of resisting this. And that's a good idea. Because we can't change everything. You know? We just can't change everything. But that's the hubris. That America has to expand in order to survive. And of course, the military-industrial complex, I keep going back to them. Eisenhower said in his valedictory, they're not bad people, they're just there. And, you know, after the fall of the communists, they needed a new enemy. So anti-terrorism became the new enemy. And when that fell off, they need a new one now. So now it's the rise of the great powers. It's about Chinese imperialism and Russian revanchism. So we got two new enemies. And of course, everybody who stacks up against these enemies are going to need weapon systems. If they don't buy it from the military-industrial complex, they buy it from the French or somebody else. So we got, you know, all these people who profit by this. And that's the way it works. You know, it just works that way. There's nothing evil about it. It just works that way. And so they're always looking for the next enemy. And these are the people who drive the Dow industrial averages. When I left America in February 1972, the Dow Jones had just gone through the 1,000 mark. Today it's about 35,000. And 80% of those companies are companies that are modernizing or providing American weapons or weapons around the world, whether it's airplanes or whatever. And so That's the nature of the beast. They make all this money. And of course they make jobs, they build these things in Georgia, and lots of Georgians are happy, and congressmen don't want to lose the Northrop or the Ground base in California or whatever it is, or Boeing. They want this. It's good for their constituents. So they're all part of the deal.
Yeah.
And I always said to myself, I'd like to come back in the next world as an arms dealer to see how it works. Because I went to a military exhibition here in Australia, in Melbourne, where they were selling arms to the world. You had Germans selling tanks, and one guy selling Turkish bombs. So did the Turkish guy. So no, I just met the Ukrainian foreign minister. He'd like some of these. The guy next to me says, don't even say that. It's against the law to say that, because you need a license to say that. I said, well, shit, now you need a license. Everybody's selling everybody weapons systems. And we think it's natural. So anyway, this guy in 1918 writes this book about, can we stay home? And I think America's overbalanced. We're rushing $1 billion loan to the Ukrainians, billions of dollars of weapons. We move thousands and thousands of people. And yet, in America, if you went to Frisco, you'd be stepping over homeless people.
Yeah.
And we have all these problems at home. We still had 100,000 Americans who died of opioid abuse last year.
Yeah.
We've got all these damn problems we can't solve. But we got all these other things we dedicate. This is why Bernie Sanders is driving people crazy. He says we got money for war, but we don't have money for tuition remission, or minimum wage. We don't have any money for Americans who are struggling. But we got money for everything. He's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Now the question is, would Americans spend money on these things if they had a choice? Of course, we don't know that. It's hypothetical. And so we seem to have all this money to send out to these armies. And I want to say one final thing. If you go to an American baseball or football game today, they will have on that football field a flag the size of the flag the size of the field, 100 yards this way, 60 this way. And they'd have the armed forces there. Everybody was talking about America's heroes, which is really sort of an adjustment to the poor behavior, the poor attitude shown to the Vietnam veterans. And Richard Nixon did something that was very interesting. He took away the draft, put it on a shelf, and he replaced the draft, which had people like you and me and everybody, every color, every religion, serving armies, and replaced them with professional soldiers. So we replaced the levée en masse, that is the army of people from everywhere, with Roman legionnaires. When the president sends them, they go out as Roman legionnaires. And they don't complain. They're professionals. These are legionnaires. Legionnaires didn't complain. They did their job. And so we always counted on the draft to put the brakes on governments. Now we don't have any brakes. We have governments that can send armies anywhere. And we treat everybody who wears a uniform as a hero. Now, they don't feel that way. That's the story they tell them. So, but, we've lost the draft, which represents America, and replaced them with professional legionnaires. You realize that changes the game. You can send them anywhere to do anything, and there's no questions asked. This is a different moment. And I worry about that because legionnaires didn't ask questions, did their job. Regular armies, when you send a regular army to Vietnam, 19% of your infantrymen in the army are black. And some cracker or southern racist lieutenant sends you up a hill to die. You're not so excited about going up that hill. because he's treated you badly your whole time there. So he sends you to die for your country. I'm not so sure about that. In the Vietnam War, we had 240 certified fragging cases. This is where officers went down into the valley and take a pee or whatever, and someone rolled a grenade down there and blew him up because they didn't like him. He was asking them to die for nothing. That's a real army, you know. When it fails there in the middle, the people at the bottom are going to revolt, and they did. But now that doesn't happen. People they go forward.
So it's almost like you want an army that represents the totality of the nation, because at that point it's only so far you can go before your lies to those people.
The army of representative people, army that represents, is the boundaries to your public opinion. You know, if they see things like Captain Kelly killing 342 Vietnamese, they're going to say something. He's not going to not say something.
Yeah.
But now you don't get that. You don't get that. And we all thought it was a good idea because the draft, the college people were driving Nixon crazy and everybody else. When you got rid of the draft, you got rid of you got rid of the people's army and replaced them with professional kids. And, you know, they're good people. And they don't question orders. They may think some of them are dodgy, but they do their job. And when you think about it, 200,000 American troops out there. You got about 50,000 in Japan alone, with their families, another 100,000. Doing the bidding of the federal government, not asking any questions. I think that's breathtaking, actually, that this change. And it goes unnoticed in America. You know, the draft was nasty and cruel. But, you know, I was the Vietnam age. There were 27 million of us who came of draft age during the Vietnam War. And we all took our chances. Some even defected to Canada, which I think is a long stretch. I'd rather go to Vietnam than Canada. But the thing is that
that's the quote of this entire conversation. I'd rather go to Vietnam than Canada.
There were, probably 200,000-300,000 kids that went to Canada. They got Canadian citizenship. It drove Canadians crazy and all the rest of it. And then, you know, in his born-again Christian way, Jimmy Carter invited them all back. Gave them all amnesty. I don't know how many came back or not. But the point is that there were choices. And governments had to listen to these people. But now governments don't have to listen to people. That's what I mean now. Governments now can do things. They can have this incredible blowback. And would force governments maybe to agree to terms they never agreed to because the public, they've lost the support of the public. Yeah. And so I think without a draft, the world becomes a little dangerous. You look at all these wars we've had. They haven't been war taxes. They've been paid for on a credit card.
Yeah.
And sooner or later, that all comes due. I mean,
the younger generation is going to have to pay that back eventually.
Well, or you're going to have to wipe the debt. And of course, federal governments aren't afraid because they can print money.
Yeah.
Which we can't. Wouldn't that be fun? The point is that there's less accountability.
Yeah.
So we've got people at the top, in summary, who are more ignorant than their predecessors, surrounded by people who don't study history anymore, who are in there to get their own reputations, for instance, become hard on China and Russia. They like the position they use. We got to do this, and this. We got people in government say, no, we have to call Putin's bluff. We have to go all the way with this. I don't know what they're talking about. I mean, don't they understand that there are ways out of this? I mean, the only alternative to war is diplomacy, by which I mean peacetime interaction, peaceful interaction. And if we're not prepared to prolong that and to deepen it, then we're going to face a cycle of wars. And you just don't have a war, you got the repercussions from the war. And as I pointed out in my recent podcast, you got 44 million Ukrainians, all of whom were given by the EU a couple of years ago, free, visa-free passage to the European Union if they're holding the Ukrainian passport. So in the first days of the conflict with Russia, 3 to 5 million Ukrainians will just drive into Poland and other places. And they'll have visas, they'll have to accept them, can't push them back the way they push the other people who came via Greece. So you got all those people. I said to a Czech friend of mine, a woman who runs an institute in Prague, I said, what about the prospect of all these people coming to Europe? She says they're already here. The first wave of already here.
Yeah.
They're not taking any chances. They're getting out of town. And they're already in Prague and places. So, but we don't talk about that in Australia. And is Australia going to open its doors to these refugees? I don't think so. I don't see that happening. But look, I'm always hopeful that there's something around the corner. People say that democracy is failing. Well, George W. Bush gave us Barack Obama. Barack Obama gave us Donald Trump, and Donald Trump gave us Joe Biden.
Yeah.
In short, the system works. It doesn't not work, it works. Able to the people.
So where's that pendulum sort
But
of
the
back?
thing is this, popular sovereignty, the rule of the people, is considered paramount. It's the basis of sovereignty and independence. But if the people are not properly educated or exposed to the great ideas, if they don't know right from wrong, up from down, then the rule of the people is as dangerous as anything we've ever had. We've got a mob rule. And Thomas Jefferson says very clearly in the early 1800s when he writes to John Adams that the tree of liberty has to be nourished from time to time with the blood of tyrants and patriots. He meant that governments always must know that the ability to resist what they're doing is held by the people. And there will be blood. So when people say no one had a right to march on Capitol Hill, that's democracy at work. The protests morphed into a riot, then became something else. But it wasn't insurrection. I mean, the right to resist is what Jefferson is talking about. That is the essence of popular sovereignty. Governments must know that the people are there to resist bad policies and bad decisions. And so when the people do resist, and you say, oh, that resistance, that's insurrection. That's not true. It's not true. And the fact that the press bought this, the fact that everybody in Congress who's a Democrat bought this, suggests how narrow their view is.
Yeah.
No one quotes Thomas Jefferson and the blood of, takes the blood of tyrants to nourish the tree of liberty. No one talks about the right of the people. I mean, what could be more natural than the people to be at the people's house? Whether it's Parliament here in Canberra, Washington, London, Ottawa. I was on Chinese television or Chinese radio about the protest in Ottawa. There's a little city in front of Justin Trudeau's door on the hill there. He can't get into the front door of his office because there's an army of citizens there who are protesting his policies. Whether they're good or bad, I don't care. But they have a right to be there. And so now he's calling out the emergencies law to disperse them. Not the military, but emergencies laws. And the people will always find you. This famous general who went to the White House, Dwight David Eisenhower, said that when the people make a decision, get out of the way. They're coming for you. The people will decide. What we have to decide as educators and as human beings to make sure the people not so much educated as exposed to the great ideas about what's the greatest benefit for the greatest number here. And how do we balance the individual with the collective? There's a fine balance there, I'm sure. And this comes to us through philosophy, through theology, through history, and other means. But we have to keep our minds open to that. Today, if you had an 18-year-old kid who told his parents in Australia, well, I'm going to do a double major at the University of Melbourne. I'm going to study theology and history. He get a very strange look around the table. How are you going to make any money off of that? And that's because Australian education, in the 48 years I've been here, has become more instrumentalism than education.
Yeah.
And education is about the overhead cost one generation pays for another. To understand what it means to be a human being in a global world. But today it's about credentials. It's about being job ready, shovel ready. And you can't have a course at university unless you check with the business community. So we're asking the business community to become the thought leaders in a university. And in fact, we've given up our mission. We provide the thoughts. We can follow them around. But now we have to check in with the business world to see if they have enough of this or that. And we stamp. I mean, I've seen Australian education go from the great experience to kind of instrumentalism. We're just stamping things now. We're turning out people because the business community says we need them. And in Australia, governments don't like higher education, even though some of them got a free education back in the day. It's because they don't trust ideas. They don't trust people who disagree with them. And they don't like the idea that there are a bunch of people somewhere who may be thinking about things they don't want them to think about. It's dangerous. So what they do is they have this convoluted Australian grant system. They get lots of bright people spending months preparing applications that nobody reads. To hand them a few peanuts at the end of the day to shut them up. I once asked a top minister, if you don't like universities, why do you give them grants at all? He said, it gets them fighting among each other and it shuts them up for a little while. He says, they're not thinking about us, they're thinking about themselves. So, you get really intelligent people who spend months preparing a grant to be read by a bunch of morons. They have no chance of getting the damn things. Your chances are about 1 in 100. And Australians, what I meant by, Lawrence says in his book Kangaroo that Australians are anti-intellectual. They don't like ideas. And governments don't like higher education because it produces all these people who think for themselves. And Australian universities do not have a constituency. That is, we can't count on anybody. During the COVID crisis, there was no reaching out to the universities. We were not offered JobKeeper. We weren't offered anything. And so vice chancellors decided to cut their losses by getting rid of thousands and thousands of casuals. They started to cover the bills. These are people who did all the hard slog, tutorials, workshops, art studios, etc. And then we find out the vice chancellors are all paid $1.2, $1.4 million for their duties to spend Chinese money, the international money. So they had all these kind of phony campuses around the world. Campus it's used to go over there. One of our universities in Melbourne, I won't mention it because I'll get in trouble. Turns out when they produce their financial papers, because they're state chartered, they have to put them in the parliament. Well, one vice chancellor in his office, in one financial year, 2019, 2020, spent $11 million on air travel and accommodation. I was like, something. And we got vice chancellors, who don't know anything, really. They were paid $1.2, $1.4 million. Keep in mind, the director of the FBI makes $165,000 a year. The President of the United States makes $440,000 a year. See what we're talking about here? We're getting about people who came into universities and started pushing universities around like Kmart, Walmart, something like that. They weren't leaders. They were talented, but generally ignorant people. So the business community doesn't owe us anything, and the governments don't like us very much. I argued that once COVID hit, instead of firing anybody, we make Australian universities free for 5 years. That way we keep everybody. And we give all those kids in Country Vic, New South Wales, country people, talented people who can go to university, an opportunity to go to university. Oh, we couldn't do that. We couldn't do that. Why? And then in that same period of time, the government changed fees for studying history and classics. Today, if you want to study history and classics, you've got to pay the same amount as you pay for a law degree. Imagine that, pricing this out of the market now. History now attracts the same fee as law does. Why would they do that? Unless, of course, they just wanted to kill it off. Why would you place a premium in studying history in an era that requires historical thought? I mean, it's extraordinary. And the press didn't pick it up because, they want to stay friendly with their governments. The press has kind of fallen in bed with governments, whether it's labor or everything. They want to be able to ask questions, have access to something. So the universities, if we all died tomorrow, there'd be no lamentation. There'd be no hurry to replace us, because Australians do not put any great faith in Australian universities. I used to say, flippantly in the 80s, when I did the ABC, the liberals didn't like higher education because they don't like ideas. Labor didn't like higher education because the unionists didn't trust the intellectuals. And the National Party doesn't read, so they didn't know what we were doing at all. So we have no support anyway. I mean, it's extraordinary that in a country of this size, that 37 universities cannot reach out to ministers for support in the event of a crisis. And we were allowed to go down the chute. I mean, Australian universities have fallen over in this period of time. See, that's the great secret that's gotten out, is that we've lost our reputation everywhere. Because the funny money left. And these Asian kids, and even Australians, they're not going to pay $80,000 for a business degree online. It's like learning how to cook over the phone. It doesn't work. And yet, people will continue to buy us because we're going to give them a diploma at the end of it. Well, I know kids who are paying $80,000 a year for a degree, and they went to these MOOC courses at Harvard for $107 a week. At the end of 10 weeks, they got a Harvard imprimatur on a piece of paper saying they'd taken this course, which is all they wanted anyway, was Harvard on their CV or resume. And so we've made some. I mean, right now, all the vice chancellors, they're heading. Some of them are being pushed out. Some of them are heading back to England because they're going to be with their families, because they know that the halcyon days are over. The funny money is over. They may be asked to do something. And when I started in the 70s, all the vice chancellors in Australia were leading public intellectuals. They were philosophers. They were lawyers. They were this and that. And when they spoke, people listened. 10 years, you see one vice chancellor go on public radio and talk about the public health crisis or anything? No, they don't. They're not there anymore because they don't have the wherewithal anymore. And so higher education is kind of falling by the side. But the key is, why did they make the study of history? Why did they put it out of the reach of ordinary people? It's extraordinary to me. We should be doing more of it, not less of it. And they placed this premium price on it, so you couldn't do it anymore. So if I'm just an ordinary kid and I tell mom and pop, I'm going to study history and philosophy, by the way, I'm going to pay a lot of money for it, and they'll say, well, do you have a job at the end of it? Of course you're going to have a job at the end of it. The idea is how to teach you how to become a human being in the global world. When I was a kid, it was what makes you human. Now it's about what makes you human in the global world, and then you get your job. But now people imagine that Australian universities hand you a ticket somewhere, so everyone will just stamp this thing. It doesn't work that way. Higher education doesn't work that way. As soon as the government does that, they've sort of strangled the whole process. But and I always say to these kids the last day of class, say, hey, look, it's up to you. The history of Australia is not carved in stone. We may disappear. There are great societies, like the Assyrians, whose final artifacts wind up in the British Museum, on a wall, as etchings or some ruins in the ground. I mean, there's smarter people than us disappear from the face of the earth. And for some reason, we think we're going to last forever. And that's because we do not know that history is not linear. There is no reason on God's earth we should go on while others disappear from the face of the earth. And so we have a challenge in front of us. Is how does Australia survive in the 21st century, faced with global climate change, faced with these pandemics? God knows what the next variant is going to be. And we're challenged with the nuclear arms race and poverty and migration. We've got all these real problems. And I don't know if we have enough people around to think them through. I know we don't. Because I see it. I guess the answer, I'd like to see Australia return to free education again. Anybody who has to go to university should be allowed to. They got the grades. But they don't want to do that anymore. They want to make it very selective. And for those who want to study the subjects that unlock the earth, they want to make that as difficult as possible. And you say to yourself, is this conscious or unconscious decision? I think it's very conscious.
Yeah.
You know, I think, the Liberal Party, God bless them, they had a chip on their shoulder about education, higher ed, because they see many left-wing people there, labor people. And a lot of the unionists, they don't like universities because they think it breaks down the goals of equity. They think, why should someone with a university education get a step up over a unionist for a job? And so we have a lot of people in university who are the university is drifting. They don't know what their place is. And because we don't have any vice chancellors with moral standing, there isn't anybody there with the great book. There might be a few very tired Nobel laureates around, but we don't have anybody with the moral authority. And I can prove that because in the last 10 years, with all the crises we've faced, not one single vice chancellor has gone on air to provide thoughts. Think about it out loud. They're not there. They now regard themselves as very highly paid executives with bulletproof windows. They have advisors, speechwriters, they have limos, and they have first-class credit cards. They swan around the world, imagining a world that doesn't exist. It really is extraordinary what I've seen. And I've shut out about it because, I'm one person. But people who could have done something about this, it is the famous older men and women who were professors in the 60s and 70s. And they saw it changing. They didn't fight it. The corporatization of the university. They didn't fight it. And it's not because they were cowards. It's because they were so sure they were right, they didn't think they had to do that. When you're really sure of something, you don't go to war.
So sure you're right.
You're so sure you're right. And it's for a lot of those people who could have stopped this nonsense, they didn't because they were sure they were right and that these people were not going to let go. Okay.
Joe, there's a couple of things you said there. You mentioned, going back to you mentioning these museums full of these artifacts, you mentioned we can't be sure that we're going to be here. My wife and I were just in the National Museum today, and we're looking at all of these artifacts, and one thing I want to mention is every painting, every artifact has a chip in it, a crack in it, everything there has undergone some sort of collapse, and I just want to say, this has just been such an honor, you're certainly, if I'm any judge of wisdom, you're one of the wisest people I know. If I'm any judge of intelligence, you are certainly the most intelligent person I know. But I want to ask you one more question before I go, and then I'm going to have to wrap this up and go on my date night with my lovely wife. An Australian student of theology, podcaster about philosophy, going to America. What's your advice? For me going to America, what do you think is the best advice you could impart with me as I go over there?
Well, Americans will embrace you and your Australianness because you're different. I once wrote a book, and I think I can send you the page proofs about what Australians know about America. And that is almost nothing.
Let me pause you there. My wife was in an elevator. She was recently in California. She was recently in an elevator. 2 Californians got on, and they were all excited. They just got back from Europe. Hey, where are you guys coming from? You know, she's like, well, I'm from Australia. One of the Americans in that elevator asked, do they speak English over there?
Yes. I heard the same thing at Harvard, my Harvard wife. Do they speak English?
Yep.
Yes. And one time I was in for a big job in Tennessee. And I thought I was going to get the job. But this faculty wife comes up to me at the cocktail party with the 3 finalists. And she says to me, look, before you disappear, she said, I want to ask you what a didgeridoo is. We can't figure it out. This is 1984. So I figured I'm not going to get the job because she could have looked it up in a dictionary. This is before the internet. People didn't want to use the dictionary. And I thought it was out. But anyway, when I say in this book, the Americans, they like Australians because you remind them of frontiers, the open road. You know, I point out in the book that 84% of Australians are cooped up in cities. Forget the outback experience. They love Australians because of their knowledge is inversely. Their liking for Australians is inversely proportional to what they know about it. There's nothing. You know, the first minister in the 1940s that went to America, he did the first Gallup poll, and Australians weren't sure. Americans weren't sure what Australia was, but they knew they liked it. And he commissioned some work, and he found out that you should get Americans interested in boat travel, so they can go to Australia, wallpaper for their kids to see wallabies and kangaroos on the walls and stuff like that. And he said we should sort of cultivate this ignorance. Now, I've written some of the first books about Australian-American relations when I got here, and they're still quoted by presidents when they visit to Australia, but they don't quote me because somebody looks at the book and, you know, we've been comrades in arms all this time, et cetera, how much we have in common. But Americans have a love affair with Australia because Australia is of the mind. It's an imaginary place. I mean, they have no idea how rough life here was. You know, and I try to say to them, in the First World War, there were 4.9 million Australians, and 59,000 died in the war. 300,000 injured. So you realize if you had that percentage dying of Americans, you had millions of Americans that died. I mean, Australians started out as the Prussians of the British Empire until the imperial trade-off ended. They couldn't protect them anymore with the fleet. And Australia is a very, very tough place. And what I like about Australia is if you got an idea, people will listen to it. They like it, they might even invest in that idea a little bit. But in America, you'll be treated very well, as long as you're Australian. If you start to adapt American ways or you come up with an American accent, they'll just regard you as anybody else.
My brother has tried desperately his whole time over there to keep his accent. And he sounds more Australian than I do, you know, and it served him well.
Well, I don't know how you lose your accent. And a funny story here, in the 80s, I started using some Australian pronunciations. I used to do the notes on the news and the editorial before the news, news at 7 o'clock. And these are the days you taped. And I had a producer named Doug Weller, and I was doing something, I think, these 2 Australian boys were being hanged in Malaysia. Did a famous editorial. 2 Australians died yesterday, or I was doing something on SDI. I used an Australian pronunciation for something. It might have been, I said corollary instead of corollary, or I might have used missile instead of missile. And this guy stops in the middle of this. Listen, we're going to go on air in 10 minutes. I said, what are you doing? I said, I don't know. He says, you got an Australian pronunciation there. He says, you know, if you talk like an Australian, they're not going to believe a word you say. When you're talking about America, you got to sound like an American. What good advice that was. You know, I could have easily drifted. And then I used to brag for years that I had an American accent all these years because I must have a very strong character. And then a linguist, a woman I thought the world of, she said to me, no, actually it's insecurity. Because she was studied languages and her mother still had this heavy Japanese accent after many years in Australia. She said, no, it's your brain insecure about where you are. So you're frozen in time. You still speak like someone from Brooklyn or Oakland or Chicago. She said, it's not about strength, it's about weakness. And I thought, well, that takes the wind out of my sail. You know, I thought I was this heroic figure. It turns out that I was clinging on to things. But I think it's very, very hard for a person to lose their accent. I've seen it. I've seen people slip into it. And I'm always amazed when Naomi Watts and Nicole Kidman and those others, Margot Robbie, slip into those American accents. It's extraordinary to me. And as soon as they're off camera, there's Australian as meat pie. They go right back to it. But the point is that as long as you are who you are, you will have entree to places. People want to meet you. And as soon as you try to pretend you're one of the pod people, not pretend, you become a pod person, they'll be less interested in you. But I don't think you're going to lose your accent.
That's it. That's always my challenge is trying to remain as true to the person that I am. And I think that comes across in the podcast as well. People can hear when I veer off track on a path that is clearly me trying to be something that I'm not, and that's always my challenge, and I do really struggle with that because I want to fit in, I want to, and I've always tried to look the part even before I was the part, but that's good
Well,
advice.
you have a very interesting persona because you slip into many guises.
Yes.
Right now
all things to all people.
No. Right now we could be talking about why the Cincinnati Bengals lost in the last 2 minutes to the Los Angeles Rams. Because you can be a sports commentator or a philosophy commentator, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd say, your friend said you had this kind of a Renaissance image. I've been accused once of being the head of the Renaissance of nuclear studies because I did a 2-volume work, which no one quoted, but everybody said was important. Yeah. But you're more ecumenical.
What does that mean?
Ecumenical means you're universal.
Yeah.
You can go anywhere, interview people in a village in Cambodia or outside of Cambodia, or you can go to a western town on the eastern slope of the Rockies, or you can go to New York, and you, even though your accent's always the same, you fit in you fit in neatly. You're unafraid to explore the world. That's your great advantage. Some people don't want to leave their comfort zone, but you have an ecumenical, universal outlook that is, you assume that everybody has a story, and it's important, at least to them, and you assume that you can understand it, and you assume that they understand what you're saying to them. You realize you've passed all these hurdles. Most people don't want to talk to a foreign audience about anything. And of course, if you understand that human nature never changes, everyone is going to plug into what you're saying. They understand exactly, and you understand them. So you have this great communication skill. You can move back and forth between different groups and feel very comfortable. And more importantly, they can feel comfortable with you. So you can sit down with theologians at Rice University, I suppose, and talk about this or that, or you can go to the Harvard Divinity School and talk about this or that, or you can go to Berlin and talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer with this person or that person.
You realize now I'm going to get you to help me to get into those places.
Oh yeah, I know all these people, and they'd be happy to have you. I mean, you move very, very easily into these different groups. And I do want you to go to the internet and have a quick look at Karl Popper.
I will.
I mean, he was this really famous dude. He wound up as one of the top Cold War philosophers. But more importantly, when I got to UQ, University of Queensland, I found out that one of the most important philosophers in the world failed to get the lecturer's job in philosophy there. They didn't like him. Wow. They said he didn't have a future. He's good. is the wave.
Yeah.
And it's the small provincial universities that, even though they're sandstones, they have this provincial outlook, and they turn their back on Karl Popper, which is right up there with the critic who said about Fred Astaire's audition, dances a little and doesn't sing very well. Wow. Sometimes you miss out on these people. But the nice thing about America is this. If you go to the East Coast and you fail, you can go to the Midwest. And if that doesn't work out, you go to the Rocky Mountain West. And then you can become famous in Los Angeles. So you got all these... See, in Australia, if you fail in one city, you fail everywhere because it's like a country town. Everybody controls... Certain groups control the media, who gets to speak, et cetera, et cetera. But in America, they have all these different centers that bounce off of each other.
Yeah.
So, if you don't make it with that guy, you go to the next guy. And then you become famous with the next guy. Who needs that guy? And then the trouble with America is that it has so many centers that you can accuse them of being arbitrary. It seems to me that a person should be able to rise, etc. And you're very level-headed. There was a guy in this country who became Australian of the Year, and the first thing he did was get a publicist and start charging $25,000 for public addresses. And he hasn't had a public address since then because no one's going to pay that kind of money.
Yeah.
I mean, if Australians get away from the idea that if you become famous for a minute that people are going to pay for it, you're in the wrong place. Australians don't do that. They don't do that. But as long as you got something to say, people will listen. But anyway, I think your approach is ecumenical. That is, you approach Christians and Jews and Buddhists and Hindu like they're human beings. And it's not easy to approach people as equals. And that, of course, was David Frost and Alexander, famous BBC guy, Nicholson. They're able to approach people on the street, and they're great. I mean, you got it. The great advantage of someone like you is that you prove once again that the essence of humanity is listening. You listen. You let the other guy tell the story, and then you pick the story, part of the story you want to elaborate on. You don't play gotcha. You don't imagine there's one truth out there. If you did that, it'd be a very short interview with people. And so what I meant by ecumenical is that you have a universal approach to people. You treat them all as normal or equal and all as human beings. And you know human beings from antiquity to the present time because not much has changed.
Yeah.
And so you got that great advantage. Now, sometimes you go to the American morning shows, Meet the Press or whatever it is. You got these presenters who start to become enamored of their own voices and their own views, like someone could give a shite. They have nothing to say, but they start to imagine that they're the main attractions, even though they're interviewing some very interesting... I was thinking, Alistair Cook is this British guy who did letters from America, go to America and send these letters, which wound up on Australian radio too. And he could talk to anybody. He could see any situation and extrapolate the universal out of it. Same thing with David Frost. David Frost let people talk. Today, if you go onto a show, people might interrupt you. I've reached a stage in my life where I don't get interrupted anymore. And if I do, the person interrupting me is just trying to get their viewpoint across, which is just an opinion. I feel like but this ability to listen to people. Now, I interviewed a lot of famous people when I was young. What happens, with a view to writing their part in the history of nuclear weapons in the Cold War. And my great secret was, well, the first thing I learned is they didn't like tape recorders. Because they didn't want to hear themselves later on. But my great gift was, I had photographic memory. So when I was done with them, I'd go and write down the interviews, what was important. And so I had total recall. And that made them very comfortable. One time I interviewed a very famous ambassador of Canberra. And this is Marshall Green, first major appointment to Australia. And we had an interview at the American Embassy in Canberra over cigars. Good cigars. And I said, well, how long is this interview? He said, as long as the cigar lasts. Now, he was too stupid to know what he was talking about. What he meant was, if you're not drawing on your cigar, it's not going to be burnt. You're not burning it. So if it's a good interview, you're not even going to use your cigar. The cigar, he says, it'll last as long as a cigar. So we had a very long interview with only a couple drags and a cigar. So you know, I learned my lesson from this guy. This is exactly what he was talking about. Now, this is unbelievable, but I have a 5:30 alarm on my phone to exercise. And I don't exercise
Well, that's
anymore.
kind of perfect.
No, I don't exercise anymore. But I kept it on the phone to remind myself of what I should be doing.
Yeah, I love it. Well, you know, that perhaps that's the sign. I mean, Joe,
Well, you got to be somewhere.
I got to be somewhere. But man, this has been so beautiful, and it's been an honor to meet you. I've been so looking forward to this.
Well, thank you very much. It means a lot. I don't know if I've got all of this right, but I'll tell you what. When I was born, the Second World War was going on. The Normandy invasion was 1 month old. Hitler was in the bunker. Joe Stalin was in Kremlin. Churchill was at Chequers, and President Roosevelt had been nominated for the fourth time. I was born before nuclear weapons. And then everything after that, I was lucky enough to have television, so I could see Korean War unfold on television, the arms race, follow all my presidents, and go to university when important people would travel around universities, just shake your head. I mean, today, you got ministers you wouldn't know who wouldn't go anywhere. They think they're important. You know, back in the day, people would just, there's Martin Luther King looking for volunteers. I mean, we didn't know how famous he was until he got killed. I mean, that's when he became really famous. But the point is, he'd already had his Nobel. But and I got to meet important people in Europe. I got to meet British prime ministers on tours on the way to Vienna. And the really important people, the interesting people, used to reach out to ordinary people like us for their lifeblood. They wanted to know what we were thinking. We wanted to know what they were thinking. And today, the separation between the leadership, if you knew someone important in government and you wrote to you called their press secretary, they tell you he's not available or she's not available for 6 months. Well, what the hell is that all about? They thought that important. It's self-importance, okay? And so we're in a time where people have holed up from the outside world. They don't want to explain it. And, I think Australians there's a spirit here about no one's better than anybody else. And they demonstrate that every couple of years in the polls. But we got people in high places who don't come down. Today if you want to know what's going on in Melbourne or in this country, you join you go to the state library, you join a corporate membership, $10,000 a year, $50,000 a year. Get to hear the president of the ANZ Bank talk at breakfast, or the head of Rio Tinto talk at dinner. These people come and talk for a fee. You get to hear them. But the idea that you have to go to a corporate event to hear what people are saying tells you there's something wrong. We should be hearing these people. And I always thought the reason these people don't talk is because there are not enough people like you who ask the questions, but more importantly, the right questions. If you don't ask the right question, you're never going to get an answer. And I don't. What we have to do in Australia is rekindle historical imagination and curiosity. Australians are very curious about the world, but there isn't anyone who wants to come down from Delphi and explain it to them. They want to keep it that way. So once in a while, every year or so, the government offers you the gong of some kind, this thing, that thing. And Australians will always queue up for the gong. They get a kick out of that. They don't know they don't know it doesn't mean anything. and we're just being put off, okay? we've had all these wars in my time here, and there's never been a discussion in Parliament. There's no declaration of war. It's a little decision made by the Prime Minister of the day and a little group next to him, whether it's Menzies, who decided in 5 minutes to get involved in Vietnam, or John Howard coming back on a plane decided to invoke the NATO treaty, the Kansas treaty, to get involved in the war coalition of the willing. I mean, there's no discussion of war and peace, and we're supposed to wear it. And the thing that shocked me when I got here is when I listened for the first time to Robert Menzies' voice. It was, I think, September 3rd, 1939, and he says to the Australian people on wireless on the radio, he says, Australians, Britain is at war, therefore we are at war. Good evening. What the hell is that all about? You can't take a people into war without a discussion. But there is no discussion because Australians still trust their leaders. So this structure exists, so the leaders can jam their decisions down their throats. That's going to change. You can't ask people to die because a few people at the top made the wrong decision. And so it's life and death. And I keep saying to my students, be careful who you vote for, they can get you killed. Well, actually, that's exactly true. They can get you killed. Lyndon Johnson can get you killed.
Now more than ever, right?
Oh, guaranteed.
Yeah.
Guaranteed. And philosophers and others in America have always argued that there should be a sort of chorus of learned men and women next to a government office to collect the wisdom for them, give them options. Instead of a couple career bureaucrats who are looking for a chance to get their spurs somewhere. And so we don't ask it used to drive people like George Curtin crazy. You get people making decisions that don't know any history. Now John Kennedy knew history. And Dwight Eisenhower knew history. Even Lyndon Johnson believed in the Munich Analogy. But as soon as we started to get to Bill Clinton and George Bush, we got people who didn't know any history and decided to do their own thing. We got presidents. I mean, Barack Obama didn't write anything before he became president because he didn't want anyone picking over it later on. That way we never know his mind. But we go back to Mark Twain. He says in his beautiful, very large autobiography published after his death, many years after his death. He says, the thing with people is we never know what to think. Just even if they leave memoirs, which is a little bit. We never know how minds work. And I always thought about that because when someone explains to you why you have to die, I want to know if they're actually telling you what they think or what they think based on reality. And if it's reality, on what basis do they see that? See, there are all these lenses. So we get people at the top who say, the Chinese are the enemy, or we'll follow America to hell. We'll do this and we'll do that. And then no one asks any questions. In this government, today I look for the Labour Party to offer robust resistance to things. They just fold in. There doesn't seem to be any dialogue here. Is that because the governments are more authoritarian or the people discouraged? Probably a little bit of both. But I'm telling you, when it really gets bad, as if there's war in Ukraine and there's no Nord Stream pipeline, and the pipeline goes dead in Ukraine, and the price of petrol or gasoline goes up 2-3 times, or inflation, whatever it is, you will hear about it. So there are all kinds of things we can do that we don't do. And as long as people like you keep asking questions, there's a chance it might come right. Just if you ask enough people a question, they have to explain themselves. And some people are very modest about what they know. They don't know how modest they are until they explain to them what they don't know. And so the dialogue, that dialectic the dialectic was there long before Marx. The very idea you have a counter idea, and then people imagine you get something in the middle. Well, actually, one or the other could be the answer. But we have to keep the dialogue open, and we have to have people who can reach out to people Now, if you look at all your major networks in the next 48 hours, you won't see anybody there except people like me who has an opinion that differs from what is advertised. I was once told by the ABC, people don't like you because they don't know what you're going to say. The Australians are desperate to pigeonhole people. They want to know what they're going to say before they open their mouths. And so since I play the ball and not the man or the woman, I'm just going to talk about the merits of the case. So they don't like that. They don't like that what they're talking to. When you look on air today, all you're going to see are people who come as advertised. And it's no fun, you know. Now we tell you what you're doing now. But, you know, we're going to have people who ask questions. And asking questions in digital are trouble. So, God bless your work.
Well,
now,
I mean, it's in the start of the poem, the sage, right? Be careful what you wish for when you ask for wisdom, right? You've got to be careful.
Yes.
Because you might just get it. You might just get something that you find very uncomfortable. And I think that part of what you do for me as well is you introduce me to that somewhat uncomfortable truth about humanity. Look, I'm going to pause this anyways.
Yeah,
so,
okay.
Yeah.
You've been listening to the Walled Garden podcast. If you'd like to attend any of our free meetups and events, or if you'd like to get one-on-one mentoring with either Sharon LaBelle, Kai Whiting, or myself, just go to thewalledgarden.com. But for now, don't forget to nourish those gardens in your mind.